The dust hung low over the Serengeti track, stirred only by the soft shift of paws. The vehicle rolled to a crawl, its engine note fading until it was little more than a hum. Ahead, a lioness had stepped into the road, her body angled slightly, head dropped so her gaze could lock on the front seat. Behind her, 4 others held their ground. 2 older females, a younger male whose mane was just starting to grow, and a cub nearly the size of a yearling. They stood loose but watchful. Tails slow in the heat. The air felt heavier than the late sun alone could make it. Inside the vehicle, the guide rested one hand lightly on the dashboard, his other raised in a small motion for silence. The driver eased the brake without a word. The lioness in front did not flinch or snarl, only shifted her weight forward one paw at a time, each movement controlled and deliberate. A warm wind moved through the dry grass, carrying the smell of dust and the faint musky scent of the cats. If they tried to drive through, it would split the pride and risk panic. If they waited too long, the animals might close in. The young male stepped forward next, his shoulders rolling as though to show his strength, but his left foreleg hesitated just before it touched the ground. It was a subtle hitch, almost hidden by the slow pace, but the guide saw it. His tail hung lower than the others, and his ears twitched in restless half-turns. The rest of the pride's eyes moved between him and the car, their formation tightening almost without motion, drawing a wider half-circle across the road. The guide knew this was no passing encounter. The lioness ahead didn't glance back for cues. She was holding position, her eyes never leaving the front of the vehicle. The dust swirled higher, soft against the light, clinging to the sheen of their coats. In the stillness, the deep sound of their breathing carried slow and heavy. The driver kept his hand still on the wheel, the idle engine just enough to hum through the silence. The young male shifted again, his weight favoring the opposite side now. He glanced toward the lioness in front before settling back on his haunches, chest rising and falling in slow effort. The guide's eyes stayed on that subtle limp, replaying it in his mind as the wind pressed hot air through the open side windows. "Just hold steady," he murmured, voice low enough to barely break the air between them. One of the older females moved up to the young male's flank, brushing her shoulder to his as she passed. She crossed the road behind the lead lioness, closing the space between the car and the grass. The risk was clear. If the pride surrounded the vehicle entirely, the only safe choice would be to remain until they decided to break away on their own. If they didn't, the team could be here for hours, heat building, with no way to move. A long minute passed before the lead lioness eased one step to the side. It wasn't retreat, but a shift, as if making space for the others. The young male followed with a slower motion, his paw dragging faintly across the dirt. The guide's breath stayed measured, his thoughts fixed on the limp, the pride's stillness, and the quiet calculation in the air. Whatever this was, it wasn't over. The sun pressed lower, shadows stretching thin over the track, and the waiting began. The young male's slow retreat into the pride did not loosen the air. Instead, the lions began to fan outward, each moving at a pace so measured it felt almost rehearsed. The lead lioness stepped toward the front left corner of the vehicle, her head turning slightly, scanning the humans inside without haste. To the right, one of the older females angled into the grass, circling until she was level with the back door. The younger cub padded along behind her, stopping now and then to glance back toward the young male. The space around the car shrank in silence. The driver eased his foot from the brake and cut the ignition. The sudden absence of the engine made the sound of breathing outside seem louder, deep, rhythmic, layered from every direction. The guide spoke only once, his tone calm and even, telling the driver to keep his hands visible and his body still. The lions did not lunge or growl, but the slow bend of their path formed a loose ring that cut off every way forward or back. If they closed the circle fully, no safe route would remain. The young male lingered at the rear, his eyes half-lidded, one foreleg still hesitant to bear his full weight. Each time he shifted, the pride seemed to adjust with him, as though the shape they made was as much for his benefit as for their caution. Above the low breathing, a faint roll of thunder passed in the distance. The sound swallowed quickly by the heavy air. The wind dropped, leaving the smell of dust and the warm musk of the cats hanging unmoved. The lioness nearest the driver's window crouched slightly, not in preparation to spring, but as if lowering herself to get a better view. Her ears pivoted forward, then sideways, each motion slow. In the grass behind, the older female's tail flicked once, the gesture quick and sharp before stillness returned. The cub sat abruptly, tail curled around its paws. Its eyes darting between the guide's steady face and the young male's slow breathing. Minutes stretched long. The guide measured each in the lion's movements. A step forward here, a turn of the head there, each one closing a gap until the vehicle sat in the center of a living, shifting ring. The risk was plain. If startled, the lions could rush in any direction. If they scattered, the young male could vanish into the grass before help arrived. For now, all they could do was wait, holding still as the shape of the pride pressed in under the weight of the late afternoon heat. The thunder faded to nothing, leaving only the deep, unbroken rhythm of breath and the whisper of tails through dry stalks. In that suspended air, the guide knew the next move would not come from them. Whatever held the pride here had not yet shown itself, but it was close, and it was watching. The circle shifted, but not to close in further. From the rear of the group, the young male stepped forward, the pride parting just enough to let him pass. His head hung a little lower than before, his mane catching the light in ragged patches where it was still growing in. Each stride was deliberate, but the uneven rhythm was impossible to miss. His left forepaw dragged for half a second before lifting again, leaving a faint, curved line in the dust beside the print. He came toward the driver's side without changing pace. His amber eyes not fixed on any single point but moving slowly over the shape of the vehicle. The guide leaned forward, one hand braced against the dashboard, watching the angle of the paw, the stiffness in the shoulder. This wasn't the steady, rolling gait of a healthy lion. It was a measured advance born from effort, not intent to threaten. The driver held still, his breath shallow. The young male's chest rose and fell more quickly now, each exhale heavy enough to stir the dust. His tail trailed low, the tuft brushing the ground. The closer he came, the more the strain showed. A small falter when he shifted weight, a subtle tightening of the muscles along his side. In the stillness, the sound of his pads on the dirt was distinct, steady but dragging on every third step. Behind him, the pride remained in position, though the lead lioness tracked his movements with slow turns of her head. She did not call or move to stop him. The cub crouched low, its chin almost to the ground, eyes flicking between the vehicle and the young male's faltering stride. The older females held their ground, their tails now still. The lion stopped just short of the door, his body angled slightly so his injured side faced away. For a moment he simply stood, the dust settling on the ridge of his back, his breathing audible through the open window. The guide's gaze stayed fixed on the drag of that paw. On the way, he shifted his weight as though the ground itself was unsteady. "It's not anger," the guide murmured, voice low and even. "It's work, every step." The words were more to himself than to anyone else, a quiet recognition that whatever had brought this lion forward was not challenge but need. The wind picked up faintly, carrying the warm, dry scent of grass over the heavier musk of the pride. The young male blinked slowly, the skin along his injured shoulder twitching once before he straightened a little. Each sign spoke plainly. He was here on effort he might not sustain for long. If he turned back now, he might not make another approach. If he stayed, the pride's stillness could break at any moment. Either way, the balance between distance and contact was narrowing with each slow, uneven step. The young male shifted his stance, turning just enough that the afternoon light caught the curve of his shoulder. Through the open window, the injury revealed itself. A deep, tearing gash along the muscle, the edges raw and inflamed. The fur around it was darkened, matted stiff where dried blood had clung before the dust settled over it. Each breath pulled the skin taut, making the wound flex in slow, painful rhythm. It was fresh, no more than a day or two old, and wide enough that muscle and sinew showed in brief, unguarded glimpses. The guide's eyes fixed on it, reading the depth, the direction. It was not the clean bite of another lion, nor the jagged tear of a hyena's work. The edges were too straight in places, as if ripped against something sharp and unyielding. Whatever caused it had left him weakened but not yet broken, though the stiffness in his gait told the rest. Infection would come soon, and with it a fever that could end him. The pride held their distance, their formation unchanged. The lead lioness stood half-turned toward the injured male, her tail hanging motionless. The cub stayed close to one of the older females, peering around her leg to keep him in sight. None of them moved closer, yet none drifted away. They were watchful, measuring each shift of his weight, each flick of his ear, each drawn breath. The guide considered the risk. If they moved to help him now, stepping from the vehicle or driving forward, the pride could break in two ways: scattering into the grass, taking the injured male with them, or closing ranks in sudden defense. Either reaction would end the chance of aid, but waiting too long could cost him the strength to stand at all. The lion lowered himself onto his good side, his injured shoulder turning upward. It was a slow, careful drop, his forelegs folding in before his haunches sank into the dust. The wound was fully exposed now, the skin twitching at the edge as flies gathered. His eyes closed halfway, though his ears stayed alert to every sound. From a distance, the steady breathing of pride was the only counterpoint to the low hum of heat in the air. The guide leaned back, keeping his own movements slow. He could see the line of tension in the lead lioness's body, the way her muscles stayed ready even in stillness. If they read any sudden approach as a threat, there would be no warning before the reaction came. The driver's hands stayed fixed on the wheel, the key still in place but untouched. If the young male rose again, it might be to retreat into the safety of the pride's cover where no human could follow. If he stayed down, the window for help would narrow with each beat of the sun overhead. Either choice would come soon, and both carried the same weight. A single wrong move could decide whether he healed or disappeared into the grass forever. The young male shifted his weight and eased himself lower, the movement slow, deliberate, as though each joint required thought before bending. Dust lifted under his flank as he settled onto his uninjured side, his forelegs folded, his haunches tucked close. He stopped only when his shoulder lay level with the open window, no more than a few paces away. The shallow rise and fall of his chest was visible now, his breaths pulling hard at first, then finding a slower rhythm as stillness took hold. His eyes, half-lidded, stayed on nothing in particular, lids fluttering once before steadying. The guide kept his body angled forward, his hands in plain sight, and spoke softly without leaning closer. "Easy, boy." The words barely broke the air, carried more as tone than sound. The young male's ears twitched faintly toward the voice, not in alarm, but as if marking its place in the quiet. The scent of him, warm, heavy, threaded with the faint metallic tang of his wound, drifted through the window. Around them, the pride remained rooted in place. The lead lioness stood where she had first blocked the road, her gaze moving only when another member shifted weight. The older female nearest the cub swished her tail once in the dry heat, then let it fall still again. No paws moved, no heads lowered in threat. They were fixed in a kind of watchful suspension. The only sound beyond the young male's breathing was the faint rasp of wind moving through the brittle tops of grass. Minutes slipped past with the scene unchanged. The guide noted the slack in the lion's shoulders, the way the muscles along his back loosened in small increments. It was not trust in the human presence, not yet, but neither was it resistance. His breathing had steadied enough that the tremor in his flanks was gone, replaced by the slow, deliberate draw of each lungful of air. Every exhale flattened the dust just beneath his muzzle before the faint breeze scattered it again. The driver didn't move. His hands remained on the wheel, his eyes fixed forward. He knew that any sudden sound or gesture from inside could snap the thin balance holding the Pride in place. The guide, too, resisted the instinct to reach for binoculars or adjust his position. The moment was fragile, a shared stillness in which the injured lion chose not to retreat and the Pride chose not to advance. In that narrow gap of calm, the risk remained plain. If another vehicle appeared, the Pride could scatter, taking the young male into cover before the reserve's veterinary team could reach them. If he decided to rise again before help came, the chance to act without force would be lost. For now, the only choice was to match his stillness, to hold in place as the heat pressed down, and wait for the opening that might not come twice. The guide reached slowly for the radio, keeping his other hand visible on the dash. His voice stayed low, each word measured as he gave the reserve's coordinates and a quiet warning about the Pride's position. The reply came in short bursts of static, the veterinary unit confirming they were on their way. He clipped the radio back without looking away from the young male, whose flank rose and fell in steady rhythm just outside the open window. The lions began to move again, not in alarm, but with the slow precision of animals shaping the space around them. The lead lioness stepped sideways, her paws soundless on the packed dirt, until she was angled toward the young male's head. One of the older females eased forward from the grass to the opposite side, her body forming part of a loose, shifting ring. Even the cub moved closer, padding in small arcs before settling behind the older female's front legs. The formation was not tight enough to trap him in place, but its meaning was clear. If the young male rose, the others would shift with him, flowing as a unit toward the grass. Any attempt to follow would be blocked by their bodies or met with the sudden speed only lions could summon. The guide kept speaking in the same low tone, not for the lions, but for the steadiness it brought. "Stay with us, boy," he murmured once, the words quiet enough that they barely reached beyond the cab. The young male's ears twitched faintly, but his eyes stayed half shut. His tail moved once, a slow sweep against the dirt, then stilled again. Minutes passed. The only changes were in the Pride's positions, a subtle shift in spacing, a slow turn of the head. The young male lifted his chin briefly as if testing the air, before letting it fall back to rest on the ground. The wound at his shoulder caught the light, its raw edges dulling as dust clung to the moisture there. The guide knew that every moment they held this balance increased the chance the vets would arrive before the Pride moved him beyond reach. In the distance, the faint hum of a vehicle came and went on the wind, still too far to count on. The Pride seemed to sense it too. The lead lioness paused mid-breath, her ears angling toward the sound before she resumed her slow watch. The older female mirrored her, keeping her eyes on the humans while her ears worked independently. The guide glanced once toward the horizon, then back to the young male. If he stood now, the ring would close and they would lose him. If he stayed, there was still a chance. In the hot, still air, the choice hung like a thread, held by a wounded animal's patience and the quiet discipline of those who guarded him. The sound of the approaching vehicle began as the faintest vibration, a low hum that trembled through the still heat. The Pride heard it before the humans saw it. Ears pivoted, heads lifted, bodies tensing in small controlled adjustments. The young male did not move. He lay in the dust with his injured shoulder exposed, flank rising and falling in the slow, deliberate rhythm that had not changed since he'd settled beside the car. Dust clung to the ragged edge of the wound, dulling the raw red beneath, flies gathering and lifting in restless circles. His eyes stayed half-lidded, blinking only when the breeze shifted the grit toward his face. The vehicle appeared on the far edge of the horizon, a glint of sunlight off metal against the pale grass. It crawled forward, its sound building until it was no longer background but the clear, low growl of an engine. The Pride shifted in response, not scattering, but adjusting their formation with silent coordination. The lead lioness moved a few paces, her stride unhurried but deliberate, bringing her to a point just beyond the young male's head. She stood square, her tail hanging still, eyes locked on the oncoming truck. The guide in the first vehicle raised one hand toward the new arrivals, signaling them to slow. The driver of the vet unit eased to a stop well short of the Pride's line, the engine dropping to idle before cutting off entirely. 2 rangers stepped down first, each scanning the lions without haste. Their voices were low and even, carrying no more than a few feet. The vet followed, the weight of the dart gun balanced in both hands, a small case tucked under one arm. From the edge of the grass, an older female shifted to make space, her body angling away from the direct path between the vet and the injured male. On the other side, the lead lioness mirrored the movement. The opening was narrow, no more than a careful lane through living muscle and intent, but it was space enough to pass. Behind them, the cub pressed close to the older female's legs, its tail curled tight, its eyes wide and fixed on the humans. The heat pressed down without mercy. No wind moved the grass, no clouds offered shade. The only sounds were the muffled crunch of boots on dry earth and the slow, heavy breath of the injured lion. It carried in the still air, in, out, unbroken, steady, and deep. The vet moved through the narrow opening with measured steps, never turning his back to the Pride, never lifting the gun above his waist. The rangers followed at a slight angle, watching the lions more than the ground. At 10 paces, the vet stopped. The young male remained motionless except for the steady expansion of his ribs. His tail flicked once, a dry whisper against the dirt, then stilled again. The Pride's gaze tracked every movement, the slight tilt of the gun, the shift of a foot, but no muscles bunched, no jaws opened. It was not trust, but permission, fragile and conditional, given for reasons known only to them. The vet raised the dart gun slowly, sighting along its length. His breath was even, his stance grounded. When the dart left the barrel, it was with a soft hiss almost lost to the heat. It struck the young male cleanly in the flesh of his hind leg. He flinched once, a brief tightening of muscle, but did not rise. His ears twitched, then settled back to stillness. The lead lioness took a single step forward, stopping with her weight balanced, her gaze moving from the vet to the injured male and back again. The guide, still seated in the vehicle, watched the slow change in the young male's breathing. Each rise of his flank came a little slower, each exhale eased out with less tension. The dust on his wound thickened as the dampness there dried, sealing the edges under a fragile crust. Flies lifted away, returning only in short bursts before drifting off again. The rangers waited, their eyes never leaving the Pride. The lions did not close in, but they did not drift away either. The formation remained loose yet deliberate, a wall of muscle and instinct around the one who lay on the ground. The vet lowered the dart gun and stepped back a pace, signaling with a tilt of his head that it was only a matter of minutes now. In the stifling heat, the slow rhythm of the young male's breath became the only measure of time. It was steady, heavy, unbroken, a sound that filled the space between two species, holding them all in the same suspended moment. The air did not move. The grass did not bend. And in that stillness, the line between danger and rescue held firm, as fragile as the heat haze trembling over the plain. 3 days after the intervention, the track along the western edge of the reserve lay quiet under the early light. The dust was still damp from a brief night rain, holding the fresh imprints of hooves and paws. It was there the Pride appeared again, moving in a loose file through the pale grass. The lead lioness walked ahead, her stride easy, her head turning now and then to scan the open plain. Behind her came 2 older females, The cub pressed close between them, and there, third in the line, was the young male. His limp was still there, but lighter, a shorter catch in his step, not the dragging weight it had been. The wound on his shoulder was no longer raw, the edges closed under a layer of dark, healing skin. Where flies had once gathered, the fur was beginning to grow back in soft, uneven patches. His eyes, once dulled with strain, were clearer now, alert and following the movement of the lead lioness ahead. The pride crossed the track without hurry, their bodies brushing the low seed heads of the grass, leaving faint ripples in their wake. The young male paused briefly as he reached the center, his paw pressing into the damp dust, leaving a full, clear print. He turned his head toward the sound of the approaching vehicle, his gaze finding the guide in the front seat. For a moment his amber eyes held steady, a brief, unbroken line between them. The guide didn't move, didn't lift a hand or speak. The young male's ears twitched once, his tail flicking a small arc behind him before he shifted his weight and continued forward. The pride accepted him back into their rhythm without hesitation, the space between bodies closing again as they moved toward the grass on the far side. The vehicle idled, watching them go. The cub trotted a few steps ahead of the older females, darting sideways to chase a grasshopper before falling back into place. The lead lioness never broke stride, guiding them toward the shade of a distant acacia. The young male kept pace, his limp barely noticeable against the fluid movement of the group. When they reached the edge of the grassland, the pride slipped into cover, their tawny coats blending into the muted green. The last to disappear was the young male, his shoulders rolling once as he passed into shadow. He glanced back only once more, not in hesitation, but in a final, passing acknowledgement, then turned fully to follow the others. The guide exhaled softly as the grass closed behind them, the sound of their movement fading into the morning air. The track was quiet again, marked only by the fresh prints leading back into the wild. In the stillness, the faint breeze carried the scent of rain over dust, and, somewhere far off, the low murmur of lions in the grass. The moment held for a breath, then the vehicle rolled forward, leaving the pride to their silence and the open plain ahead. 3 days after the intervention, the track along the western edge of the reserve lay quiet in the first heat of morning. The dust was damp from a brief night rain, holding the sharp outlines of hoof prints and the rounded pads of fresh lion tracks. The air was cool enough that the smell of grass carried more strongly than dust, a soft green note layered over the heavier scent of animals that had passed in the night. It was here the pride appeared again, emerging from the pale grass in a loose, easy file. The lead lioness walked ahead, her stride even and unhurried, her head turning at intervals to scan the open plain. Behind her moved 2 older females, their flanks almost touching as they walked. Between them, the cub kept close, its shorter steps quick but steady. And there, third in line, was the young male. The change in him was immediate and visible. His limp was still present but reduced to a short catch in his step. No longer the dragging weight that had pulled his gait uneven days before. The wound along his shoulder was sealed under a dark layer of new skin, the raw edges gone. Dust clung to the fur around it, but the flies had left, replaced by small, uneven tufts of hair beginning to grow back. His eyes, dulled before by pain and strain, were clearer now, scanning the track ahead and then drifting briefly to the vehicle as it idled at a respectful distance. The pride moved as one through the golden light, their bodies brushing the low seed heads of the grass, leaving faint ripples in their wake. The young male's pace was measured, but he held his place in the formation without falling back. When they reached the center of the track, he paused for a moment, one paw pressed into the damp surface. It left a sharp, full print, each toe and claw mark clear in the softened dust. His head turned then, slowly, toward the sound of the vehicle's engine. The guide sat in the front seat, his hands still on his knees. For a few seconds the young male's amber eyes held his, unblinking, steady. There was no tension in the gaze, no overt recognition, just a quiet meeting of lines of sight across the open space. The moment held, weightless and still. The guide made no movement, no signal, just kept his breathing even. The young male's ears twitched once, his tail flicking a brief arc against his hock before he shifted his weight forward again. The pride did not break stride to accommodate him. They closed the small gap without hesitation, the two older females folding him back into the living wall that protected the cub in their center. The lead lioness moved on without a backward glance, leading them toward the tall grass that rolled toward the horizon. The young male's limp was barely noticeable now, absorbed into the collective rhythm of the group. The vehicle remained still, the engine low, as they crossed to the far side of the track. The cub darted ahead briefly to chase a grasshopper, pouncing once before bounding back to its place. The older females kept their heads level, eyes sweeping the plains, ears flicking in constant minor adjustments. The young male followed, his stride loosening as the grass thickened under his paws. At the edge of the grassland, the pride began to vanish into cover. One by one, their bodies blended into the muted greens and browns, their outlines breaking apart as they slipped between the stalks. The light caught on the lead lioness's back once before she disappeared entirely. The cub was the next to vanish, its tail tip the last visible trace. The older females melted in behind them, each step swallowing their form until only the young male remained in view. He lingered at the margin for a breath, his mane stirring slightly in the faint breeze. His head turned once more toward the vehicle, the line of his gaze level and unbroken. It was not hesitation. There was no pause in his body, no indecision in the set of his shoulders. It was a single, passing acknowledgement, the briefest moment of shared air before he turned fully to follow his pride. With a slow roll of muscle, he stepped into the grass. The blades closed over his flanks, then his back, until only the tips of his ears showed, then nothing at all. The sound of movement faded quickly, leaving only the soft hiss of wind through the grass and the distant murmur of other life on the plain. The guide let his breath go in a slow exhale, eyes still on the place where the pride had vanished. The track lay quiet again, broken only by the fresh prints pressed into its damp surface, a trail leading back to the wild. The vehicle idled for a moment longer, then eased forward, leaving the morning to its stillness. Overhead, the light sharpened, and the first heat began to rise from the ground. Somewhere beyond sight, the pride moved deeper into the reserve, carrying the young male with them, his steps lightened, his place in their line reclaimed.